Welcome everybody. People can join as we speak. I'm getting a dinging as new people are added, but I'm hoping you're not hearing that. My name is Andrew Gage. I'm a staff lawyer with West Coast Environmental Law, and I'm joining you from the territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people on southern Vancouver Island. We, of course, have people from across the country and beyond joining from a wide range of territories. I believe that Geoff's joining us from the territory of the Lenape people. So can we all take a moment to just think about, recognize the territories that we're joining from and think about the stewardship that the nations that those territories belong to have shown to those lands since time immemorial. Today's talk with Geoff Dembicki is sponsored by the Soo Big Oil Campaign, of which West Coast Environmental Law is a part, and the Sunshine Coast Soo Big Oil Campaign. And briefly, I'd like to just mention what that campaign is. We call on local governments or British Columbians who are concerned about climate change, who are calling on our local governments to take action to protect us from climate change, including by working with other local governments to bring a class action lawsuit against global fossil fuel companies for their share of the costs that we're experiencing. We do this for two reasons. First of all, our communities cannot afford the costs of climate change without having contributions from the oil and gas industry. And secondly, the world cannot afford to have fossil fuel companies that make the massive profits they make without paying a share of the cost of climate change. The result is not only communities that can't afford to prepare for climate change, but also companies that can't afford not to stop making profits and actually do the right thing. So, we'll be talking a bit more about that at the end, perhaps. But if you haven't signed the Soo Big Oil Declaration, I encourage you to check out our website at soobigoil.ca and sign. In talking about this need to hold these companies accountable, we often hear, how can you sue fossil fuel companies? They're just providing a product that we all use. I drive, don't you drive? We use oil and gas for all of these things. And of course, even at a basic level, if we are all responsible for climate change, then the big oil companies, the big coal and gas companies, they are also responsible for climate change, and they should be doing their part. But when we actually begin to look at the history here, we realize that the fossil fuel industry has been much more responsible than just being one of the actors here, and has played a huge role. And that's what we're here to hear about today, is that context that oil and gas companies are not just one more player that needs to do its part, but a huge part of the problem. So before I turn it over to Geoff to talk about his book, The Petroleum Papers, and then do a bit of introduction on that, I'm going to invite John Allen from Sunshine Coast Soo Big Oil to give us an example of how this conversation is playing out at a local level in one region and one community. And because we're really excited about the work that not just Sunshine Coast Soo Big Oil, but our action teams around the province are doing. Don.
Thank you. And thank you, WCEL, for co-hosting with us and certainly doing all of the heavy lifting on the tech side of this Zoom experience. Thank you, Geoff, for writing your fantastic book and for speaking with us about it today. Thank you, Alea Boisvert on the Sunshine Coast Soo Big Oil team for working so hard to help make this event happen, and to Jeff Keithley and Anthony Parry for organizing our watch party in Gibsons. And most importantly, thank you to the Shishal and Squamish nations for allowing us to live, work, and play on their unceded ancestral territory on the Sunshine Coast. Sunshine Coast Soo Big Oil got started probably in about July of 2022. 10 of us or so gathered on a sunny, lovely day, got organized and created our own sort of local version of this province-wide initiative, drawing on all of the rich materials that West Coast Environmental Law supplied as part of helping people get engaged in this campaign. We developed our own website, paper and digital petition, a logo, posters, our own Google Drive. We have our own Zoom account. And we also got lots of resources to share with each other to get educated, but also to share with others as we began to have our conversations. In September, we had our official launch. Approximately 50, maybe even 60 people gathered at that event, including candidates from our municipal governments and involved in campaigning for the municipal elections, as well as our local press. So we got some good attention. And since that launch date, we've collaborated with several other organizations, and we got a Subig oil specific question included in the all candidates debate in advance of the municipal elections. We've had conversations with many of our local councillors and regional directors. And thanks to a phenomenal team of canvassers, we've gathered over 1,100 signatures, door knocking and canvassing at malls and at festivals. And in that canvassing, we've found that 72% of the people with whom we speak agree that this is a good idea and sign the petition. So right now we are looking forward to presenting to the council for the town of Gibsons on March 7th. And yeah, thank you all so much for being here. This is such an important topic, and I'm glad you're here for this presentation and for the rich conversation that I know will follow. Thanks.
Thank you, Don. Okay, briefly, this is how the rest of this event is going to go. We are going to, in a few minutes, I will turn things over to Geoff and introduce him properly. After he speaks, we're going to have some time for questions and answers, and we're looking forward to hearing from all of you. And then after that, we are going to invite you all to join breakout rooms based on your geographic region and have a bit of a discussion about what the information Geoff has shared with us means for your region and for how we respond to climate change and the growing tide of impacts from climate change that we see in each of our communities. So without further ado, this is the book. I don't know if it shows up with my blur on, but I've really enjoyed reading the Petroleum Papers by Geoff Dembicki. He's an investigative journalist originally from Alberta, regularly writes in the Tyee and Vice magazine, and he has brought together so much research in this remarkable book. It really gives a sense for those of us who can't go through the volumes of materials that are being uncovered by journalists, a sense of the history of what the oil and gas industry knew, what they did with that information, and really what their role has been in keeping the world dependent on their products so that they could make larger profits. Geoff was just telling me that the Washington Post has listed this book, The Petroleum Papers, as one of the 10 best books of 2022. So, congratulations to Geoff for that. And I think I'll just turn this over to you, and you can walk us through what you found out when you look through these hundreds and thousands of pages of documents and materials that have been uncovered from the oil and gas industry. Thanks, Geoff. Oh, sorry, I should say, if you want to buy a copy of Geoff's book, it is available from Greystone Publishing, the publishers. And, I would really encourage you. I think this is a must-read book. If you can't afford it, get it from your local library. Do read it.
Well, thanks for that intro, Andrew, and thanks to all of you for helping host this event and everyone who's attending today. And I see that we're getting up to close to 140 participants, which is really quite amazing. Especially when you consider that the role that the fossil fuel industry has played in lying to the public about climate change and blocking every substantial opportunity we've had to address the problem doesn't really get a ton of day-to-day coverage in the national media here. But I'm doing a talk tomorrow for Ontario Tech University. There's hundreds of people registered for that. I just did a talk about this for the Cambridge Forum at Harvard University, hundreds more there. There's many more events coming along. And so I think there are large amounts of people who are sick of the oil industry lying about them and are looking for ways to channel that frustration and anger. And so that's really the topic of my book and a lot of the writing that I do these days. So I was born in Alberta, spent about 11 years living in Vancouver, writing for outlets like the Tyee, and then about 3.5 years ago, I moved to Brooklyn with my partner, and continue to track the lies and disinformation coming from the fossil fuel industry for a wide variety of outlets, including the Guardian and Rolling Stone and DSmog. And so I think, you know, in trying to really grasp the magnitude of the oil and gas industry's disinformation campaign, I think we have to travel back in time more than 60 years. And I think this is important because once you realize how long the industry has been sitting on its knowledge about the catastrophic impacts of climate change, it sort of shows you that the industry has never really been interested in addressing this problem, and instead has sought to deflect and delay as long as possible to keep making massive amounts of profits from oil and gas. And so to me, the story of the oil and gas industry's disinformation campaign really begins in the year 1959. And that was the year that the industry hosted a 100-year birthday celebration at Columbia University in New York City. So there are all sorts of executives and heads of industry associations and VIPs and other influential people who attended this birthday party. And one of the keynote speakers that day was Edward Teller. And so you may be familiar with that name, Edward Teller, because he was one of the inventors of the atomic bomb. And so Edward Teller gets up in front of this room of oil and gas executives in New York, and he says, you know, I've spent my career looking at the threat of nuclear war, and I'm now studying this new threat, and I believe it has the potential to have even greater impact on humankind than nuclear weapons. And that's something called the greenhouse gas effect. And so Edward Teller begins leading the room through a description of this process that would have been quite new to all of the people assembled there. Like we're talking about the late 1950s. And so Edward Teller tells the executives when their companies pull oil and gas out of the ground and it's burned in a car engine, that releases emissions into the atmosphere. Those emissions warm the atmosphere, and potentially this could lead to climatic changes so dramatic that the polar ice caps could melt, and the very city where the industry was celebrating its 100-year birthday, New York, could one day be underwater. And so we're talking about a guy who invented the nuclear bomb here. Like this is not like a leftist environmentalist or anything like that. And so you had to imagine that the executives would have taken this very seriously. They would not have just written this off. And we don't have any record actually of what the executives or companies there thought in response to Edward Teller's speech. However, we do know what some of them did shortly afterwards. So when I was going through and looking at historical records of this event, I learned that one of the other keynote speakers that day was an oil and gas executive named Robert Dunlop. So Robert Dunlop at the time was head of a company called Sun Oil. They were based in the American Northeast, and they were also looking to expand into Canada. So 4 years after Edward Teller's warning about climate change, Robert Dunlop was up in northern Alberta, and he was helping Sun Oil set up the very first commercial oil sands operation. Sun Oil later became the company Suncor, which is now the largest oil and gas producer in Canada. So even before the oil sands were started and commercially tapped, leading to the exploitation of the fourth largest oil reserves on the entire planet, the executives who did that knew that this would accelerate climate change, but they went ahead and did it anyway. And so, this is hugely significant to me because it shows for the entire lifespan of this industry in Alberta, people have always been aware of what that was doing to the planet for decades and decades and decades. So I was born in Edmonton, Alberta, and for those of you who have also lived in Alberta or have visited, you know that oil is really central to the culture there. And I actually lived down the road from the Strathcona Oil Refinery, which is operated by Imperial Oil, the Canadian subsidiary of Exxon. And when my brother and I were just kids, my family would bring us to a playground that was in a ravine just underneath the oil refinery. And so I have memories as a kid being on the monkey bars with my brother, looking up at the edge of the ravine, and seeing refinery stacks with 30-foot flames shooting out of them into the air. And of course, when I see pictures of that playground in the refinery now, it all seems very apocalyptic. But at the time, that just seemed normal to us. So I had a lot of friends and family working in oil and gas, and a lot of discussions about the importance of this industry as I was growing up. Of course, I had a bit of a rebellious streak, and so I decided to become a climate change journalist after I graduated from high school. But it wasn't until about 10 years or so ago that I realized how pivotal the Canadian oil sands are to efforts to block and sabotage climate solutions all across Canada and the US. And when I really clued into that fact is when I read some of the early reporting about the Koch brothers. So Charles and David Koch, the oil and gas billionaires that financed one of the biggest disinformation campaigns in modern history, an effort to convince millions of people across the US, Canada, and the world that climate change isn't real. And when I first learned about them through articles like Jane Mayer's expose in the New Yorker, I wanted to go deeper, and through research that I did and that other reporters did, we learned that a huge source of the Koch brothers' profits, a key piece of their business empire, is a refinery in Minnesota that processes oil from the Canadian oil sands. In fact, it's the biggest refiner of oil sands oil in the US. And there's a book recently by Christopher Leonard called Kochland, which makes the case that the Koch brothers never would have become some of the richest people in the entire world without this refinery and all of the profits it generates for the company. And so learning this was kind of a shock to me, because I realized that this industry that I'd grown up in, the refinery I looked at as a kid, was connected to this massive machine of lies. And I myself had benefited from that machine growing up in Alberta. And so after that, I decided to dedicate myself to understanding this campaign, how it was financed, and the impact it was having on people all over the world. And so fast forward a few years, the Los Angeles Times and Inside Climate News published these really explosive reports showing that Exxon had studied climate change internally as early as the late 1960s and 70s. At one point, it had paid $1 million for this super tanker that was sailing around taking climate measurements. And that reporting, you know, absolutely blew me away. But there was a piece of it that I thought didn't get enough attention in Canada. And that piece of it was that Exxon's subsidiary in Canada, Imperial Oil, actually conducted a lot of this cutting edge climate research. And part of the reason that Imperial Oil wanted to learn more about the impacts of climate change was because Exxon and Imperial were considering drilling in the Arctic, and they wanted to know how their offshore platforms could potentially be affected by shifting ice flows and other impacts of climate change. And so around this time that I was starting to look more deeply into this, an organization called DSMOG, who I write for now, they're a media outlet that focuses on climate disinformation. They got access to a huge trove of documents from Imperial Oil. And these were documents going back to the 1960s. There were hundreds of them. And when taken as a whole, they show how the company's thinking on climate change evolved and changed over the decades. And so I started to take a look at those documents. I wrote a short article about one of them, but I soon realized that there was a lot more here than could be contained in even a long journalistic article. And so really that became the basis for my book. And the papers in the title, the Petroleum Papers, refers to that huge cache of documents about Imperial Oil. But as I was going through the Imperial documents, I realized that there were other similar troves of oil industry materials scattered all over the internet. There were internal documents from Shell, from BP, from Exxon, from trade associations. And some of these had been reported on, some were public. But I realized that for the average person, it was difficult to get the big picture. Like what did all of this stuff add up to? And so in addition to the stuff I was looking at with Imperial, I decided to read all of these other documents too. And so I literally went through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of documents. Many of them were marked confidential. And when I was done reading them, I felt like I had a real sense of what the industry knew about climate change and how it had decided to lie about it. And people always ask me, well, what was like one of the most interesting or shocking things that you learned while going through all of that? And for me specifically, it has to be this document from 1993 that was produced by Imperial Oil in Canada. And that document detailed how the company was investigating solutions to climate change. And so you have to understand, like, climate change was not even really on the public's radar in a huge way at that point. James Hansen had only given his testimony to Congress about climate change 5 years earlier. And that was really the first time that climate change was covered as a major news story in outlets like the New York Times. So it's only a few years after that, people are learning about climate change for the first time. The public is getting concerned. Governments are moving into action. And Imperial Oil, meanwhile, is so advanced in its understanding of the issue that it decides to commission a report about how the Canadian government could fix climate change if it chose to do so. So Imperial hired a modeling firm, an economics modeling firm, and it looked at what would happen if the federal government implemented a national price on all of the carbon emissions released across the economy. And Imperial learned through this report that this policy would have the effect of stabilizing CO2 emissions, and then they would start to decline. Imperial also learned through this research that this wouldn't have a major impact on the economy. In fact, it could probably even be good for Canada's economy. And that's because governments would be getting so much revenue from taxing carbon that they could invest in a massive green infrastructure build out that would create all sorts of new industries and jobs. So this is 1993. Imperial knows that it's possible to stop carbon emissions from growing, and that doing so would have a lot of positive economic impacts. And so what does Imperial do with this information? Well, as part of the study, it learned that this type of carbon price would potentially cut $800 million of revenues from its oil and gas operations. And so Imperial created a separate memo, which I read through, that it also shared with executives at Exxon, instructing them on how to spin this research for people in government and media. And it told the executives to stress that any serious climate policy would have horrible economic impacts. It would shut down the country. Thousands of people would be out of work. And it told them to instruct policymakers that there was an unknown environmental benefit to trying to fix climate change. We didn't even know if it would be any good for the planet. And of course, Imperial had learned the exact opposite. And Imperial, through spreading this type of disinformation, I think was really able to set the parameters of the entire conversation that we're now stuck in. Anytime you bring up some sort of environmental solution, there's always this fear that it will be horrible for the economy and put people out of work, when in fact, that hasn't been the truth. It would just be bad specifically for Imperial's oil operations. And right around this time, as the public was getting more and more concerned, this sort of disinformation strategy really took hold in a big way across Canada and the US. Koch Industries convened a bunch of scientists in Washington, DC, and they discussed various strategies for convincing the public that climate change isn't real. There was an organization called the Global Climate Coalition, which brought together major utilities and oil and gas producers and other corporate interests. And they created memos that specifically described how to confuse people about climate change and make it think that it isn't real. And the issue is so new in people's minds that the oil and gas producers, with their superior knowledge of climate change based on all the research that they had done for decades, were effectively able to set the terms of the debate and confuse people and affect the public understanding of this issue to such an extent that by the end of the 90s, large majorities of people all over the place didn't think that climate change was even happening. And so when we talk about lawsuits holding the fossil fuel industry accountable, this is really what this is really what it's all about. These companies deliberately lied to the public over the course of decades in order to confuse the public, to convince governments to lay off on regulations that could fix the emergency. And now we're living with the impacts of that. And I started this conversation in 1959, which is a long time ago. And it's sometimes hard to imagine how events back then could still be relevant now. But the the same strategy of cover up and denial and delay is still being used to this day in Canada and the US. There was recently a major congressional investigation in the US that subpoenaed all sorts of internal emails from oil and gas companies. And the results of those emails, or the material that you can read in them, is quite shocking. Shell, for instance, which positioned itself as a global climate leader, a company that was moving away from oil and gas to an energy producer, said internally that all of its net zero promises should not be taken as serious policy for the company. It should not guide their investment efforts. And in fact, Shell, coming off one of the best years last year in its history in terms of profits, is now walking back from a lot of its renewable investments. Similarly, in Canada, there's an organization called the Pathways Alliance, which is comprised of the 6 largest oil sands producers. And it is going on an absolute advertising blitz, telling Canadians that it takes climate change seriously and that it has a plan to go net zero by 2050. However, I've recently looked at documents showing the Pathways Alliance's submissions to the federal government. And in those submissions, the organization says that its net zero plan is actually intended to boost oil and gas production. It wants to cut emissions at some of its operations and then sell more and more of its oil and gas overseas to global markets under the branding of low carbon oil. And in fact, the Pathways Alliance, which just paid for a full page ad on the cover of the Toronto Star, saying how seriously it takes climate change, the companies behind that alliance are expected to increase their oil sands production by as much as 1 million barrels per day over the next 7 years. And so this is not an industry that is taking climate change seriously. And as my research in this book shows, and as the research of many other investigative journalists and researchers demonstrates, it's the industry has known about this crisis and has taken every opportunity it can to deflect and protect its own profits ahead of the well-being of everyone else. And so I'm going to wrap up pretty soon and take some questions for you, but I do want to note that, you know, while the effort to sue oil and gas is new and building very fast in Canada, it's very much well underway in the US right now. There are more than 20 jurisdictions across the country that are suing big oil for the types of lies that are documented in my book. And many of those lawsuits actually have cleared procedural hurdles over the last year or so, and are now moving forward. And so I think we are at a real inflection point where some of these efforts to achieve accountability for the oil and gas industry's deception might start to result in legal victories in the courts. And so I'll leave it there for now, and we can move on to questions.
Thanks very much, Geoff. That was, as expected, a fascinating talk. I'm going to ask people to use the raise hand function if they are able to ask questions, and just go from there. If you, for some reason, are not able to unmute yourself and ask a question, you can do it in the chat, but I may miss it because there's a lot going on in the chat, some of which are more comments. So, Teresa.
Hi, Geoff. I have to congratulate you on that wonderful work that you're doing, and I hope that you can keep it up. My question is kind of a personal one. Have you ever had death threats, or do you fear for your life for this kind of work that you're doing? Because you're challenging people who are some of the richest people in the world. How do you sleep at night? I know that you're doing the just work, but I mean, really, it's, yeah.
Well, I mean, I want to maybe knock on some wood, because I haven't really had too many threats other than a few cranks in my email inbox now and then, and of course legions of Twitter trolls. But I think there's this misunderstanding of power, of the power that we all kind of hold in relation to the fossil fuel industry. It can seem like, you know, we're all just these tiny people up against these massive corporations, but in fact, you know, contained in all of these documents I looked at is this real fear from the industry about what the public thinks about it. The entire time they were studying climate change, it was in order to come up with strategies for deflecting the public's fear and anger, because the industry realized as soon as enough people clued in to the damage the industry was doing to the planet, this public anger would result in government regulations that would force the industry to move away from oil and gas. And so I think, you know, in these types of circles, it can seem obvious that the oil and gas industry has engaged in a campaign of lies, but I don't think that reality has really sunk in for the vast majority of people. And once it does, that's going to be a powerful force to hold these companies accountable. And so I guess I feel less worried about the type of research I do because of that fact.
Julius.
Yes, thank you very much, Geoff. That was very enlightening. And again, many thanks for all that you're doing. This is, you know, as they say, not every hero wears a cape. Now, I was very concerned about learning about some of the things you mentioned about, like, for example, the Pathways Alliance, trying to get on board with you know, students and teachers to again, to continue this idea of a bright future for oil and gas and so on. Now, we're at the tail end of one of probably several pandemics that we're looking down the line, partly because of climate change, and people are really exhausted, they're feeling despair and so on. And so I think it's going to be important for us to balance a message of alarm with that of hope and motivation. Now, with that in mind, what would you think in your mind, what would you recommend being a good approach to trying to counter this message that, say, the Pathways Alliance is spreading to impressionable youth these days, especially in hopefully the most effective way, in your opinion, to get them on board with taking on oil and gas industry's threat to the planet? I have some ideas, but I'm curious to what you might think of that.
Well, you know, in a lot of the media interviews I've done about the book, people say like, wow, this seems like a really depressing topic. Aren't you just kind of like angry and demoralized all the time? But I found actually learning about the role that the industry has played in blocking climate action has actually resulted in the opposite for me. It's been kind of invigorating in a sense, because for so long there's been this idea out there that we're all equally responsible for climate change, and in fact a lot of this messaging was specifically pushed and created by oil and gas companies, because if we're all responsible, then actually nobody is responsible.
Carbon footprint sort of idea, and
which was really popularized to a large extent through the efforts of companies like BP, for example. And I don't want to say that, you know, we don't all contribute in terms of our emissions, but what my research showed me is that over the last few decades, we've had huge moments of possibility when all the factors were aligned to get the transformative policy solutions that we need to really fix this emergency. And all the factors are there. They've been there since the 90s when Imperial Oil studied how to fix it. And the one thing that stood in the way and blocked those efforts time and time again was the oil and gas industry and its allies. And so I think once people realize that this is a problem we can fix, this is a problem that when we fix it, will make our lives better, it will create new jobs, it'll create new economic opportunities, and that it's just a relatively small group of companies and executives standing in the way of that. I think that's a really powerful message for people, and I know that I feel a lot of agency with that understanding of the emergency.
Thank you.
Before moving on to other questions, it's been pointed out to me that because we are recording this event, that if you are asking a question, you will appear on that recording. So just a reminder to those who are unmuting to ask questions that to be aware of that if that's a concern for you. Louise?
What do you think about, I have looked at the statistics on lobbyists in Ottawa, and you won't be surprised to see how many times oil and gas lobbyists visit politicians. And they're really lobbying hard for carbon capture, subsidies, like millions of dollars of carbon capture. And somehow we need to fight that. What are your best recommendations to tell the government, don't listen to their lies? You know, this is just another delay tactic, right?
Yeah, well, and the Pathways Alliance is the main oil and gas organization now pushing the idea that the industry really cares about fixing climate change and wants to get to net zero by 2050. What the Alliance doesn't mention is that it's actually a registered lobby organization, and it's met with federal Canadian officials nearly 200 times since 2019, according to the lobbyist registrar. And when you understand that the goal of deploying carbon capture is to make the oil sands a little bit greener so that it can expand and sell more oil than ever overseas, any federal taxpayer money that's going to carbon capture technology is actually enabling the industry's long-term growth strategy. But I don't think that fact has really sunk in for very many people. And so I think we should view any federal support for carbon capture, especially after the most profitable year ever for oil and gas, as another oil and gas subsidy that goes directly against any sort of serious plan to fix climate change. And so I'm just trying to get the truth of that out by quoting the industry's own documents. And so I would like to see just a shift in public understanding around those types of issues.
Thank you.
I can't resist stepping in and giving my own comment on that, which is that the subsidies to the tobacco industry dried up when they were sued. And there's a relationship between holding these companies accountable in the courts and being able to directly challenge the government's perception that this is a wealth-creating industry that they need to subsidize. And also, of course, carbon capture and storage is premised on the idea that they only need to reduce their own emissions and have no responsibility for the emissions from their products, which again is a key part of this campaign. Ron.
Hi, Geoff, thanks. I heard you talk at the Readers and Writers on Denman Island about your book, Are We Screwed? I wonder, just as an aside, if you still feel as hopeful as you did at the end of that book. My real question, though, is about the fact that the companies are giving, massive amounts of money back to their shareholders who, to keep them happy, so they won't vote to change and make a difference. As I'm sure you're aware, motions have been put forward that they spend some of their profits on clean energy, and yet they refuse to do that. And nobody seems to be able to crack into their armory, or however it is, to change them to make a difference. So you look at Alberta and the massive amounts of money they're making. The shareholders are happy. The government of Canada is happy because they keep getting tax revenues. How do you have any suggestions for how to crack through that?
Well, I think it's worth pointing out that when the pandemic first hit and the price of oil tanked, even going to the negatives at one point, the Canadian oil industry came to the federal government demanding that the government relax climate and environmental regulations. And the argument was the industry just can't afford to do any of this green stuff. Now, coming off their most profitable year ever, those same companies are arguing that they still can't afford to invest in things like carbon capture, and that it will take billions and billions of dollars from the federal government to make that happen. And so I think what that shows you is that there's never going to be a time when the companies are going to do this voluntarily. And the only way to sort of build the political will to enforce the types of regulations that would begin to wind down this industry is through the types of social movements that are being catalyzed right here. And Andrew talked about tobacco. The history of that is a big part of my book. And I interviewed a lawyer who was part of the legal team that successfully sued Big Tobacco for hundreds of millions of dollars in the late 90s. He's now working on similar lawsuits against the oil and gas industry. And he said the biggest lesson he took away from the tobacco days was that an industry that looks invincible and impervious to any sort of pressure can quickly lose its defenses once public opinion shifts. And he watched that happen in a matter of years and even months with Big Tobacco. And he thinks the same thing could happen again with oil and gas.
Thanks.
Thanks. Maybe there are a couple of questions that have been posted in the chat, and not to displace the people who are unmuting themselves, but I did say that people could put questions in the chat. So one is a question about whether we need to hold the the oil industry responsible for plastic waste pollution, and how that relates to what you looked at in your book. And then secondly, a question about how your work in the scholarship connects to Black liberation and Indigenous resurgence. Can your research be part of a powerful weapon for abolition and decolonization?
Well, yeah, the plastics thing is kind of linked to that to an extent, because one of the things the industry is doing, the oil and gas industry is really good at anticipating threats to its business model and then figuring out creative ways around that. So one of the things that the industry is looking at in order to ensure its survival in a world that's moving more aggressively fix climate change is pivoting towards producing more plastic. And that might produce slightly lower greenhouse gas emissions, but it's not that's not welcome news for any of the Black communities, for example, that live in Louisiana's Cancer Alley, which is a string of petrochemical refineries that has created some of the worst cancer rates on the entire continent. And so I I think the way that this connects to Black liberation and Indigenous liberation is that the downstream environmental impacts of oil and gas tend to fall hardest on lower income racialized communities. That's true in Canada, and it's especially true across America, where Black and Latino communities are often located next to huge polluting refineries. In fact, the company Suncor, which made all sorts of Black Lives Matter promises and pledges, does not often like to talk about the fact that it's one of the biggest polluters in the state of Colorado due to a refinery it has there, and that the communities next to this refinery are low-income Latino communities with very high rates of cancer and asthma. And so I think as we seek to hold the industry accountable and transition to cleaner forms of energy, that will also have the impact of improving the health and economic well-being of Black, Latino, Indigenous, and any sort of communities, virtually overnight. You can put in an emissions reducing policy and you might not immediately see the impacts of that. But if you shut down an oil refinery because it's no longer economic, the air gets cleaner virtually overnight.
All right, moving down the list, Daniel.
Hello. Thanks so much, Geoff. I haven't read the book yet, but I'm really excited to. I'm a filmmaker and journalist. I've covered BC forestry a lot over the last 10 years, and I'm really interested in this line of investigation that is essentially, where an industry does some sort of harm on communities or the environment, and they knew what their activities were doing were going to cause that harm. They covered it up. They spun some lies to muddy the waters of the debate. And I would imagine that that's a playbook that's used across different industries, not just the oil and gas industry. So what would you suggest to other journalists and researchers who are interested in pursuing similar lines of investigation into other industries in terms of how did you dig up your information?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's a playbook that's used across industries. And actually, it was really fascinating for me to speak with that lawyer who was part of the legal effort against big tobacco, because he said the linkages between how tobacco covered up its own science about cancer and how the oil industry covered up its own science about climate change, they're not necessarily metaphorical. Like at one point in the mid-90s, both of their disinformation campaigns were being run out of the same organization, the National Association of Manufacturers, which included among its members cigarette makers and also oil and gas producers. It's the same people working on those campaigns. It's the same people coming up with the internal strategy documents. And so I would say in looking at other industries that face some sort of huge health or environmental liability from their business model, I would guarantee that those companies are actually the experts on those environmental and health threats, that they've studied those for decades, and that they probably have a better understanding of those issues than a lot of the people in government or outside the companies. And so I would say anywhere that there's some type of vulnerability to a business model about that, there probably will be documentation or some sort of discussion about what the companies know. And sometimes that will be at an industry conference where everyone gathers to discuss emerging threats. Sometimes it will be in documents that are accessible through archives or freedom of information requests, or sometimes industries just publish this stuff in plain sight because they think the public won't care. And so there are a bunch of different ways to sort of, peek behind the curtain on these things.
Oh, thank you, Geoff. There's still a bunch of questions on the queue, and we're only about 5 minutes left scheduled for questions. I would like to, and apologies to those who've been waiting patiently, bump Adrienne Carr up a bit because she's been playing a lead role in this in Vancouver. And Adrienne, would you like to ask your question?
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. I actually joined this call to get some inspiration from everybody else after last night's vote. But I just wanted to relay what some of the councillors who said at the table who voted against Sue Big Oil in hopes of hearing answers to those questions and how people would cope with trying to turn people's minds around. So the questions that got asked, number one was they were actually points really. Number one was, this case will never win. The second was even 1 cent is too much per resident of Vancouver to put into it, which would have been $6,622. We need an outside organization, an NGO, to fundraise for this. Number three, that basically it is our job as a city to repair the damage and not to go to court. We just recognize, so it's almost like industry should do what they want. That's their job, is to create. Anyway, and I guess the fourth point is I think the most interesting question, which is, if we raise money, if we go out there and raise money from civil society, who is best positioned to take this case on? Like, some people said, well, maybe it should be an NGO. And I said, well, they don't have costs. We have costs. But maybe you can explain, like, who is best positioned to take on a case like this, and in whether it's BC or outside BC.
Okay, I'll try to respond to each of those points. Well, I think what I would say is, not only is it doable and financially feasible for cities to bring these type of lawsuits, but lots of cities are already doing it. And so San Francisco and Oakland were some of the first to file these liability lawsuits against Big Oil, and they're very similar to Vancouver in some ways. They have very expensive housing markets. They're West Coast cities that are feeling the effects of sea level rise. And what those cities did was bring in the law firm Hagens Berman, which was involved in the tobacco litigation, and they didn't wait for any big public vote or to get permission or anything like that. They said, our citizens are feeling the impacts of climate change every day, and with the guidance of this expert legal firm, we're launching these cases. And that quickly spread to dozens of other cities across the US, Honolulu, Baltimore, New York City, cities in Colorado, across the Midwest. And so there's a playbook in the US that shows how it can be done. And so I'm not the expert on sort of the logistics of a municipal legal action, but I would say that cities are some of the best are some of the best stakeholders to bring these lawsuits, because as you said, they have to pay for the climate damages, and the cost of those damages is adding up all the time, and cities have a vested interest in provincial and federal governments fixing climate change. However, the oil and gas industry has a well-documented history of blocking all of those transformative regulations. And so without all of that lobbying and delay and obstruction, city like Vancouver wouldn't have to pay the exorbitant amount on climate damages it now is. And so you can demonstrate financial harm, you can put a price to the damages, and quantifying all of that stuff is very valuable for any sort of legal effort.
Okay, yeah, it's 155 million a year right now for
And
Vancouver.
it's a lot of money.